Good morning, church. So I bought this t-shirt a few weeks ago. There's a married couple that has a child with Down syndrome. They created this company that makes t-shirts and sweatpants and coffee mugs and different things that have messages on them about embracing people with special needs. And I bought this shirt because, well, for one, my daughter. Also, I wanted to support this family and their company, but I also like this particular t-shirt with this particular message: embrace difference. Because I think there are so many areas in our lives where this message is applicable, right? It's not just about people with special needs, but it can go in so many different directions. And in particular, I think it's a great shirt for the conversation that we've been having for the last handful of weeks about race, about racism in this world. And so I started the discussion a number of weeks ago, preaching a sermon on racism and the gospel message in relation to racism. And I got so much good feedback from you, encouraging words from you. Some of you said that it really made you reflect on your own life and look inward. Some others said they had never really thought about racism in terms of the gospel message and how those two might relate to one another. And so I appreciate that encouragement I got from you. And then later that week, we had a video conversation between me and two of our missional partners, Dieter Harnan and Glenda Johnson, and we continued that discussion about race in our world. And Glenda, I think, did an amazing job helping those of us who are white to think about life from a different perspective, right? She had so many good things to say that really opened our eyes and made us realize that those of us who are white don't truly know what it means to be a person of color in this world, that we really have no clue what it's like to be a person of color in this world. She talked about the sugar-coated racism that exists in many places in our nation, and she talked about always being on, because she knows that as a black woman that she always is being looked at a little differently, and so she has to be on, right? And those of us who are white, we've never really had to think about the fact that we're white. Or at least I'll say for me, that's never really played into my mind to think about that I'm white, and so I don't really know what it's like to always have to be on, in the way that Glenda talked about what it's like. I recently heard a black preacher from Memphis, Tennessee talk about how he not long ago had to buy a dash cam. He felt the need to buy a dash cam, a camera to put on the dash of his car, just so in case he encounters any sort of accident or trouble of any kind, that there's always kind of video evidence of what took place. And I can't say that I've ever had to worry about that. Never had to think that way. And so I think it's been good. And Glenda, I think, did a really great job of graciously teaching us this truth, that it's very different to be a person of color, and that those of us who are white can never truly know what it feels like. So, one of the questions that I keep getting from a lot of people since that sermon and the discussion with Glenda, one of the questions I keep getting is, what can I do? What can I do? And I talked a little bit in that last sermon about some things we can do. We can listen, right? We can listen to one another. And that's true of not just race, right? That's true of anyone that we encounter, that we take the time to listen, to graciously listen, and give mercy to this person that we are listening to. And the other thing I talked about was that we can start by looking at ourselves, right? Turning this inward and looking at ourselves and seeing what's inside of us that might need to change. What else can we do? What else can we do? Well, I think the other thing we can do is my t-shirt. This is why I'm preaching in a t-shirt, if you're wondering. We can learn to embrace difference. We can learn to embrace diversity, and not just learn to embrace difference, but learn to truly celebrate difference, to celebrate diversity. Okay, so what in the world do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes I hear people make a statement when it comes to race, and I believe it's made with the best of intentions, and many of you have probably said this very same thing, and I know that I have said this very same thing. I don't see color. When it comes to people, I try to be colorblind. Have you said something like that before? Again, I think it is said with the best of intentions, but the problem is I don't think the goal is to be colorblind. I don't think the goal is to ignore someone's color or ignore someone's race. The goal is to actually see their color. The goal is to actually see their race and to embrace their color, embrace their race, to celebrate the beauty of their color, to celebrate the beauty of their race. The goal is not to be colorblind, but rather the goal is to see all colors, to see all races, to see all cultures, and to learn to appreciate and celebrate that difference, celebrate that diversity. So let's stop right now and let's spend a little time having some discussions in the groups that we might be in, whether it's our family or our small group. But why don't we talk about this question? What have you done in your own life to help you truly see and celebrate people of different races? What are some things that you've done that have helped you come to learn more about and to celebrate and to appreciate people of different colors, people of different races? Spend a little time talking about that and then come back. Okay, so I love this picture that John paints in Revelation 7. So in the book of Revelation, the very last book of our Bibles, he's been given a glimpse into the throne room of God. He's been given a glimpse into the throne room of heaven. And in Revelation, he's trying to describe what he sees in that throne room. And so around the throne of God, he sees heavenly creatures, and he sees earthly creatures, and he sees all these different angelic beings. They're all surrounding the throne of God. And then he says this in Revelation 7. After this, after I saw all those things, right? The heavenly beings, the earthly creatures, the heavenly creatures. After I saw all this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and all peoples and all languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb." I love this vision that is being painted for us by John. This vision, this glimpse into the throne room of God that he gets. I love what he describes. And I heard someone once say that if you don't like racial or cultural diversity, then you might not like heaven. Because in heaven, we're going to have every nation, every tribe, all different people, all languages gathered together in one place. Now, the text doesn't say whether or not they are praising God in one language or not. And so I guess it's left to our imagination. I like to actually envision this as though they're all speaking their own tongues. They're all speaking their own languages as they lift up these praises to God. Because I like to think that this picture in Revelation 7 of all these people and tribes and nations and languages being gathered together around the throne, I like to envision that as being a reflection of Pentecost in Acts 2. So in Acts 2, you have the story of Pentecost, and you have all these people from all these different tribes and all these different lands and from all different languages that are gathering together in Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost. And at the same time, you have these Jesus followers who are all gathered together in an upper room. We're told there are about 120 of them. They're gathered together in this upper room and they're praying and they're doing what Jesus told them to do. Jesus told them to wait for the power that was to come upon them, the power of the Holy Spirit that was going to come upon them. And so they're up there, they're praying. All these people are gathered in Jerusalem, but these Jesus followers are up there praying. They're waiting for the power to come. And you know the story. They hear this loud roaring wind and they see the tongues of fire rest upon them all. It's a crazy story. And then we read these words in Acts chapter 2. Acts 2, verses 4 through 13. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and even visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds and power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." Did you notice how many times in our reading that Luke pointed out that they all heard in their own native language? Over and over, it was repeated a number of times. We hear in our own language. They're hearing in their own language. We all hear in our own language. And I think what's cool about that is that they did not hear one voice. Pentecost did not hide their diversity, but rather put their diversity on display. Pentecost highlighted their diversity because they did not hear in one voice and they did not speak in one voice, but rather they all heard in their own language. Their diversity was highlighted in the story. And what's really cool is that throughout the book of Acts, diversity is highlighted. Throughout the book of Acts, diversity is highlighted. And in many ways, the book of Acts is a book about embracing diversity. It's a book about overcoming racial barriers. Acts is a book about doing the very thing that Paul talks about in Ephesians 2, tearing down the dividing wall of hostility. And story after story in the book of Acts, we get examples of that dividing wall of hostility being torn down. So, spend a few moments right now. I'm going to share some examples, but spend a few moments right now seeing if you can think through in Acts some different stories that might highlight this truth, that the book of Acts is about tearing down barriers. Spend some time talking about that and then we'll come back. Okay, so here are a few examples that I immediately think about. Well, one is Acts 2 that we just looked at, right? The story of Pentecost. And they didn't hear in one voice, they didn't speak in one voice, but rather they all heard in their own native languages. All these people from all these different lands and languages heard in their own native language. And so I think Acts 2 is a story that highlights diversity. I think another great story is in Acts 6. And Dan talked about Acts 6 a little bit last week. Acts 6 is the story that we refer to as the creation of the deacon role in church. And what's really happening in this is that there's a race issue. Go back and read it in Acts chapter 6. Here's what it says in Acts 6 verse 1. Now during those days, when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And so ultimately, the issue was a race issue. The Hellenists widows were being neglected in favor of the Hebrew widows. And in that culture, the Hebrew widows would have been the majority culture in church, right? And if you read the story real closely, what happens is they create a leadership group that is composed of people from both sides so that they can come together and figure out how to tear down this dividing wall of hostility. So I think its story in Acts 6 is a story about race. I think another great story that maybe you thought about was in Acts 10, the story about Peter and Cornelius. And it goes from Acts 10 to Acts 11. And it's a story about Peter, a Jew, encountering Cornelius, a Gentile, and God is the one who orchestrates this meeting. And Peter fights against it, and he says, no, that's not what I do. But here is what he eventually learns. He eventually learns this truth. He says, God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but that in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. It's a story about tearing down the dividing wall of hostility. And this thing kind of happens over and over and over in the book of Acts. And as they are tearing down these walls of division in Acts, they're encountering a temptation. And the temptation that they encounter as they're tearing down these dividing walls of hostility, the temptation is this: should we or should we not make everyone fit into the same mold? As we tear down these walls of division and we overcome these barriers between us, should we make everyone do everything the same way? Should everyone assimilate into one way of doing things? In the story of Acts, it's always the Jews trying to figure out if they should make everyone else act like Jews. And the answer over and over, overwhelmingly, is no. No, we don't. They were consistently being challenged to embrace diversity. They were consistently being challenged to allow the different races and the different cultures to continue in their own ways. This is actually the big argument that takes place between Paul and Cephas in Galatians 2. And I mentioned Galatians 2 in my first sermon about racism. Right? You got the story about Cephas, and he's been hanging out with these Gentiles and eating dinner with them, sitting at a table with them, and then all of a sudden these Jewish leaders come down, and Cephas feels pressure from them to back away from the Gentiles, and he distances himself from them. And Paul ends up saying, how can you compel Gentiles to try to live like Jews? How can you compel the Gentiles to try to live like Jews? So this question, this temptation, do we make everybody assimilate into one way of doing things? This is one of the biggest reasons churches consistently fail at being multi-ethnic. Right? This is one of the biggest reasons there are predominantly white churches and predominantly black churches, predominantly Hispanic churches, or predominantly Asian churches. Because the temptation is always to make everyone assimilate into one way of doing church. I've had black friends who attend predominantly white churches, and I've heard stories of them being asked or hearing comments about how they should try to sing more white. I've known black preachers who have preached in predominantly white churches who have been pressured to change their preaching style because his style didn't fit the dominant culture of the church he was in. There's a long tradition of black Christians expressing themselves in song in a very different way from the way most white people do. And in a lot of ways, black Christians have a different hymnal catalog. There's entirely different songs that many of them sing. I don't think it's racist to point that out. In fact, it may be racist to try to deny that. to try to hide that truth. Nikki and I have had this discussion over and over again, and we're not ever sure where to go with it, but we have this discussion all the time. Many of the songs that we sing, if not all the songs that we sing, in both our a cappella and our instrumental services, come from predominantly white musicians or groups, right? A cappella, we sing a lot of Zoe worship or Kenyang and Halal and other things, right? We sing a lot of that. That's predominantly white. And our instrumental, we do a lot of Hillsong and Bethel and different things like that, predominantly white worship bands. And so we've had this discussion, how can we do a better job of exposing ourselves to Christian artists, Christian songwriters who are not white? How can we do a better job of exposing ourselves to that, to worship bands that are not white? And then how can we not just learn to expose ourselves to it, but then how can we learn to incorporate that into our own worship here? Because we are probably considered a predominantly white church, but we have black families at this church. So we've been challenging ourselves with trying to figure out how do we do that? How do we embrace that difference, not just by acknowledging it, but figuring out how to celebrate it and to expose ourselves to that? And it's a challenge. It takes intentionality. It takes intentionality. Listen to this, church. Without intentionality, organizations will naturally gravitate to homogeneity. It's this idea of everyone being one, everyone doing everything exactly the same way. Without intentionality, all organizations, including churches, will naturally gravitate toward one way of doing things. And that's why it's so hard to find truly multi-ethnic churches. Because if you're not careful, a multi-ethnic group will eventually gravitate toward the majority culture. And when that happens, all the other groups are pressured into assimilating into that culture. And I think that's what happens when we try to be colorblind. Which again, right, is not the goal. Because when we are trying to be colorblind, we will naturally gravitate toward one color. But the goal is not to be colorblind. The goal is to embrace difference. The goal is to embrace diversity. The goal is to celebrate all cultures, to celebrate all races, which means we need to take the time to truly learn about the different cultures, to truly learn about different races, to truly learn what it means to be black in a predominantly white world. Or to learn what it means to be Asian or Hispanic or Middle Eastern. Perhaps this is the way we best live out the command to love our neighbor. Right? To truly see our neighbor in all of their uniqueness, to truly accept our neighbor as Christ has accepted us, and to truly celebrate the diversity of God's creation. Perhaps this is the best way we live out that command. Our very own Carl Jemison, he and I had a conversation about this past week, and he reminded me of a passage from 1 John. He said he was surprised I hadn't brought it up yet, that it's one that he would go to in a situation like this, and I think it's a wonderful one. It's 1 John 4 and verse 20. It says, if someone says, I love God, but yet hates a fellow believer, that person's a liar. For this, listen to this, church. For if we don't love the people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? So, last discussion question. How do we live out this verse? How do we live this verse out? What are some tangible ways that we can show that we truly love the people that we see, which would then reflect our love for the God we can't see? What are some tangible ways we can do that? Spend a little time discussing that, and then we'll wrap up this sermon. Okay, church. So we listen, we learn, we celebrate. Because the truth is that one day we will all be gathered together around the throne of God. All the different nations, all the different tribes, all the different peoples, all the different languages, and we will all be praising God together. And so we might as well get used to it now. Embrace difference. Celebrate diversity.